Welcome to episode 25 of our podcast. Last week, we finished off introducing the late Baroque period and the different aspects of music and things that make up the late Baroque period. Today, we're going to start looking at different specific genres within the Baroque period, and we're going to start with Baroque instrumental music. In most cultures, music with words is the norm. Strictly instrumental music is less common or less important. So it is with popular music today, and so it was with the early music of Europe. In the Middle Ages, Gregorian chant was sung by monks and nuns to liturgical texts, and later some of these same texts were set to new polyphonic music for cathedral choirs and royal chapels. Troubadours set their love poems as solo songs. In the Renaissance, love poetry was set to music as madrigals, intricate part music for a few solo singers. Vocal music was still very important in the late Baroque era, as we shall see a little later on. But part of the importance of the Baroque era was that for the first time, listeners and musicians began to take instrumental music much more seriously. A momentous change was set in motion, and the reason for it are not entirely clear. It can hardly be a coincidence, however, that the rise of instrumental music took place at the same time as a similar development in the technology of instrument making. The name of Antonio Stradivarius is known to many because of auctions where prices can soar past the millions of dollars for one of his violins, unmatched after 300 years. They rarely do come to market, although they can be found. Instruments by other master builders of the era, less well known, can still sound glorious. The organs of Gottfried Silbermann, the harpsichords of François-Étienne Blanchet, the viols of Baroque Norman, as you see here. In any case, the rise of instrumental music meant that there had to be a basic understanding between composers and audiences about instrumental forms and genres. To pose the most basic question, when the music starts, how long should the composer keep going, and what should the listener expect? With vocal music, the answer was, roughly speaking, until the words end, when the sense of the sentence, paragraph, or total text is completed with a punctuation mark, a summing up, or a concluding passage. For instrumental music, there was no such sense. Conventional forms and genres had to supply it. Here we're going to look at the most important instrumental forms and genres established, developed, and refined in the Baroque era. And then later on, we'll take a look at vocal music as well. So first, we're going to take a look at the concerto and concerto grosso. The concerto and concerto grosso, or the plural for that of concerti grossi, are the most important orchestral genres of the Baroque era. The basic idea underlying these genres is to contrast between an orchestra and a soloist, or a small group of soloists in a concerto grosso. Indeed, the word concerto comes from the Latin word concertare, or contend, an origin that accurately indicates a sort of contest between solo and orchestra. The contest pits the brilliance of the soloist or soloists, and brilliance often involves improvisation, against the relative power and stability of the orchestra. Contrast comes to these genres naturally. Then, a good deal of Baroque music is more uniform, as we will see. But people soon tire of music that stays more or less the same. Composers who wanted to develop large-scale forms had to find ways of bringing contrast into their music. They wanted large-scale forms because audiences, then and now, were more impressed by extensive compositions than by short ones. So one of the ways that they did this was by introducing the idea of movements. One way to extend a composition was and is to lay it out in several movements, or to put it in another way, join together several smaller songs or movements as a single composite work. A movement is a self-contained section of music that is part of a larger work. Movements can be compared to chapters in a book. Movements in a multi-movement work will always show some variety in tempo, meter, key, mood, and musical form. The typical late Baroque concerto had 3 movements. The first movement was bright and extroverted in a fast tempo. After this, the second movement strikes an obvious contrast. It is a quieter, slower, and more emotional movement. The third and final movement is a fast movement again, if anything faster than the first. In the first concerto we'll study here momentarily, Vivaldi's Concerto in G, the first and last movements are in ritornello form, and the second movement is in ground bass form. With that being said, what is ritornello form? Many concerto movements are written in ritornello form. From ritornello, the name for the orchestral music that typically starts the movement off. Contrast is basic to the concerto, and ritornello form focuses on contrast between 2 musical ideas or groups of ideas, one belonging to the orchestra and the other to the soloist. The orchestral material, or the ritornello, tends to be solid and forceful, the solo material faster and more brilliant. Ritornello, the Italian word for return, tells us that the function of the ritornello in ritornello form is to return many times as a stable element of the form. Usually it returns only in part, and usually it is played in different keys as the movement proceeds. As for the musical ideas for the solo, sometimes these are virtuous passages, sometimes themes, sometimes larger sections including themes and other material. To end the movement, the orchestra ritornello returns in the tonic key and, often, at full length. Ritornello form can be diagrammed as shown here, where RIT or rit stands for the entire ritornello. The rit in brackets for any part of the ritornello, and solo 1, 2, 3, etc. for the solo sections. We need not worry too much about the exact number of ritornello fragments, the key, and other details shown in such form diagrams. More important is the general impression that the form gives, the sense of a sturdy, reliable support in the orchestra for rapid and sometimes fantastic flights by the solo or solo group. As a condition for the quasi-improvisational freedom of the solo instruments, the ritornello is always there, ready to bring them back down to earth and remind us of the original point of the departure. So now we're going to start by looking at our first instrumental Baroque piece. This one will be by Antonio Vivaldi, who we'll talk about him a little bit more in the future, in the very near future, and a piece he wrote called Violin Concerto in G, known as La Stravaganza,
Opus 4,
number 12. It was written around the year 1912 or 1913. The undisputed champion of the concerto was the Venetian composer Antonio Vivaldi. Vivaldi wrote hundreds of concertos but published relatively few of them, in sets of 6 or 12. Each set was given a work number, opus in Latin for work. To some opuses he gave titles which evoke the extravagant side of the Baroque dualism, such as Harmonic Whims, l'estro armonico, and Extravagance, la stravaganza. This concerto in G is the last and one of the best of his Opus 4. It is a concerto for solo violin and the basic Baroque orchestra of strings and continuo. On our recording, the continuo chords are played by a large lute called an arc lute. The orchestra is quite small. In the age of Antonio Stradivarius, violin maker supreme, a great deal of music was composed at least partly to show off this favorite instrument. The violin's brilliance was especially prized, as was its ability to play expressively. The concerto in G begins and ends with movements in ritornello form. So we're going to take a look at the first movement. Spiritoso e non presto. Spirited, not too fast, writes Vivaldi at the start of this triple meter movement. The first and second violins of the orchestra echo one another brightly. The opening ritornello, which can be seen here with its typical loud, extroverted sound, consists of 3 parts. The first beginning with a couple of loud chords to catch the audience's attention and set the tempo. That is our A section. Then a central section which sequences. That is our B section. And then a cadential section featuring loud and soft echoes, as we see here with our C section. Once the ritornello ends with a very solid cadence, another typical feature of Baroque ritornellos, the solo violin enters, first with music moving at about the same speed as the ritornello, but soon speeding up. Virtuosity for the Baroque violinist meant jumping from the high strings to the low, executing fast scales, in fact, any and all kinds of fast playing. Ritornello 2 is an exact repetition of C. The second solo has several subsections, in one of which the continuo drops out entirely. Ritornello 3 begins with derivations of B and C, but then wanders off freely and ends in a minor key. This provides a springboard for some expressive playing in the next solo. Ritornello 4 is freer still. It takes just enough from the original ritornello, or part B, so that it seems to fit in with it and, indeed, to grow out of spontaneously. Vivaldi seems to have wanted his first 4 ritornellos to feel freer and freer before he finally pulls the piece back in line. After the last solo, or following ritornello 4, cuts in very energetically, he ends the movement with a literal statement of B and C. Absent is A, perhaps because it's a wake-up function and is no longer needed. Compare the inner form of this movement with the standard outer form, as we saw previously. So, let's take a listen to Vivaldi's Violin Concerto in G, first movement. So that was the first movement from his Concerto in G. Next time we'll start off by talking about his second movement, because remember we spoke about before the fact that the first and third movements were in the same form, and the second movement was in a different form. But before we end off today, I thought maybe I would tell you a little bit about Vivaldi himself. So, Antonio Vivaldi was born in 1678 and lived until 1771. He was the son of a Venetian violinist. Antonio Vivaldi was destined to follow in his father's footsteps. He entered the priesthood, where his bright red hair earned him the nickname of the Red Priest. Then, at the age of 25, he became a music teacher at the Seminario Musicale dell'Ospedale della Pietà, a Venetian orphanage for girls. The Ospedale was one of several such institutions in Venice that were famous for the attention they paid to the musical training of their students. A large proportion of Vivaldi's works were composed for the school. The Ospedale allowed him frequent leaves of absence, so Vivaldi toured a good deal, but the composer's contract specified that he should write 2 concertos a month for the pupils. If he happened to be in town at the time, he would also rehearse those pieces. Near the end of his life, Vivaldi left Venice permanently to settle in Vienna. Internationally renowned as a virtuoso violinist, Vivaldi is remembered today chiefly for his brilliant concertos. He wrote more than 400 of these, including concertos for harp, mandolin, bassoon, and various instrumental combinations. We know of more than 250 solo violin concertos, including the Concerto in G of our set that we're hearing. Critics of the day complained that Vivaldi's music was thin and flashy, and that the composer was always playing for cheap effects. But the young Bach, before writing his Brandenburg concertos, carefully copied out pieces by Vivaldi as a way of learning how to write concertos himself. Vivaldi's most famous work, it has been recorded well over 100 times, is also one of his most unusual. The Four Seasons, a set of 4 concertos which illustrate, in one way or another, spring. You hear bird songs, gentle breezes, and so on. Summer. You might think of taking a nap in the sun. Fall, with a tipsy peasant dance at a harvest festival. And winter, the horrible wind, to quote from the score. Baroque composers were fond of musical illustrations, especially with the words of vocal music, as we shall see, but they seldom pursued it this far. Since no reliable portrait seems to exist of Vivaldi, we've shown a contemporary caricature of him. And with that, we'll leave it there for this episode. Next time, we're going to look at that ground-based form that the second movement of this concerto's in and have a listen to that movement. And then we're going to move on to thinking about Johann Sebastian Bach and the Brandenburg Concerto No. 5. So until then, cheers.